Let's just check. Yeah, okay, great.
Yes. Okay.
Should we go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bueno, estamos listos y listas para comenzar. Creo que ya ingresaron todas las personas que estaban en la sala de espera.
Are we ready to begin? I believe everybody that was in the waiting room is now in here. So good morning, good afternoon to each of you. My name is Soledad Vogliano from the ETC group. It is a great honor to be with you today. The first methodological note has to do with the interpretation. Remember that we have interpretation in Spanish and in English, and you can choose your language clicking on the globe that is at the bottom of the screen. So today, it is a pleasure for us to be able to welcome you to this third session of the process that we named predictable surprises. And this is a small program that has been developed in the context of the project of the Along Food movement, which has been developed by ETC with an international panel of experts in food, whose perspective somehow is to develop tools to be able to scan the horizon related to how we can transform the food systems in the next decades. And the idea of being able to put into concept the predictable surprises, since it has to do with understanding on one hand how these big changes happen in the context of the food systems, and some that we could see from behind, but we did not prepare ourselves enough. And on the other, which are these surprises that from the civil society have been generated, and that sometimes immediately and sometimes through the years, we're able to be cause big transformation, big steps in the process of food sovereignty, and in such a way that they could plan these surprises. So there we created incredible tools where Pat Mooney, which is one of our founding members of ETC, has transmitted to us. And I think it is very interesting. And we have had learning and reflections intergenerational having to do with activism for food sovereignty, for the health of the food systems. And part of the vocation of this process that, well, we're now finishing this first effort, but it has to do with socializing these tools, finding others who would also like to use this way, or these glasses, as we call these lenses, to be able to look at the scenarios and start to articulate other ways of talking about how we can transform the food systems. To be able to start off today, I am going to pass the floor to Veronica so that she can give a short synthesis of what we have been talking about, and then we will start up again with Pat and the methodology we will have today for this closing session. Thank you very much, Soledad, and thank you all who are connected now. there is quite a bit of continuity from the first session, and we have also been distributing recordings of the previous sessions together with the transcriptions, but all of that will be looking more like a final document that will be more useful for all of us. In the first session, even though the session was called Looking Back, and we heard mostly how Pat was sharing this possibility of looking at the horizon and turning the surprises into something else for the benefit of the food systems, of the food sovereignty, of the organizations and of the people. And even though this was looking back, it was very interesting that everybody who was there already gave quite a few ideas related to this preparation or being prepared, or how to deal with what is coming. The first session was looking back and we saw historical cases. The second session, we got deeper into some cases and some trends as well. And from the first session, all I can say, I can share with you some of the ideas that are complete in the documents and in the recordings that are very strong, even from the first session. For example, to be ready for to improvise, we have to be developing that, to build financial capability, and to have flexible structures in our organizations, to study disasters, because the disasters are built and can be and will be more and more frequent, to build institutions that protect us and respond whenever we need it, to start with the small, as can be the pollinizers, but to think territorially, to know that in the answers cannot be in areas that do not connect. They can't be separate or set apart. To remember that the solidarity during times of crisis makes us build alliances that go beyond the crisis. The need of finding arguments that inspire and can engage many sectors, not only the sector that we are working in. To see the crises that are happening now in some places as the future that can happen in other places. To think seriously about how to tackle those unpredictable things, or those things that we cannot predict nor control. Think about that. And also to rebuild constantly the communities and the people in the communities, because we need to be prepared for any eventuality at any time. All of this came out in the first session. In the second session, we listened to, for example, Silvia, who got deeper into the next pandemic. And within other things, she said the amount of open questions that were said during the COVID-19 crisis, the amount of questions that were brought up, they still have no answers. And well, we found that to be very important. Simply if we could give an answer or demand an answer to a lot of the questions that came up during the pandemic, it would already be an exercise to prepare us, a preparedness, because the next pandemic, according to the trends, according to the situation of the vaccines, of the pharmaceutical chain, supply chain, and the situation of the industrial agriculture has not changed even 1 millimeter. So we could say there's another pandemic coming up, and all the questions that we asked during this time, we also listened to the crisis of only one kind of pollinizer, which is the bees, pollinator, that is the bees, and it is an apocalypse apocalypse for those who are producing honey, which is usually indigenous areas, more forest areas, more rural areas. And they also added comments having to do with the crisis, having to do with the water and the collapse of internet. Pat also spoke on how absurd some of the supply chains are, the situation they are in now, and the irony that the weapon industry has serious issues to be able to have something as simple as the ammunition, to be able to have access to ammunition. So that is an example of a supply chain crisis that we are not going to glorify, but just to say how absurd the relationship between the different chains in the supply chain. We saw that in the second session. And in this session, the idea is if we can begin to answer questions regarding what do we need in our fights, in our organizations, to be able to strengthen this preparedness, this view and action in present time of preparedness. We understand that all of this is going to start coming to happen or coming alive in practice. And when we reach our communities and our cultivation areas or our study groups in the universities or wherever we work, we understand that in practice, this will be the main part after these sessions, what we do in the practical part, in the hands-on part. And we want to emphasize that maybe we have heard a lot about the idea of the early warnings, but in this effort, we want to focus on the early listening, and that the practice of listening to what everybody says with time and being open and open to surprise, that is a practice that has grabbed onto our happy, our life, how things pass so quickly. And we want to focus on this listening. So that would be it. I will leave it here and we will give the word now to Pat Sole. Yes, thank you, Vero. This third session then, that is focused on the learning to be able to receive the future, is going to start off with an intervention of Pat, and we have called him the surprising scope of these predictable surprises. And then we will have time to talk and ask questions at the end. So, Pat, it's all yours. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and Soledad, and I think we've already learned quite a bit during these last two sessions, webinars, that and so it's a chance for us to build on those discussions and amplify some of the points, I guess. So I'm almost going to be recapping some of the points that Veronica has already touched upon, but perhaps giving them some more specific examples that we can bear in mind for the future. But probably the key message is that, and as we've discovered, is that surprises can come from anywhere. And in some ways, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference where it comes from. That's not so much the issue as it is, what do you do when you have the sense that it is coming? And of course, how we respond is going to change just enormously from whether we're talking about local communities or the national scale or the international scale. We're talking about department or state level interventions, or again, rural communities. It'll be different. Our cultures will be different, but some of this of the cues, I guess, to identifying surprises and some of the steps that can be taken can be relatively similar, and we can at least take some hope from that, and also look from that point as to how we make connections with other sectors to understand when a surprise is happening and what our role is in responding to it. So it would be a mistake to think that we are preparing for predictable surprises in the food system or in the food movement. I mean, the surprise that is devastating to the food movement and food sovereignty could be a surprise that comes from the health sector or from war or from an economic crisis. And so we can't even begin to think that way. We've got to think more broadly than that and understand then as people who are involved in the food movement, if that's the case, or the health movement or labor movements, that from that perspective, then where do we fit into that surprise? How do we respond to it? Surprises often seem to be just local at the beginning. They have a local manifestation that perhaps will go nowhere. An example of that is in the case of wheat rust in Uganda at the turn of the century, 1999, when a rust struck Uganda. It didn't seem like it was going to move easily to other places until wheat breeders realized that they hadn't been paying attention to rust as a disease in the wheat crop for half a century. They'd ignored that. They thought it was being taken care of by both some plant breeding, but mostly by the use of agrotoxins. And it turned out that wasn't the case. And so suddenly what was a Uganda disease spread not just across East Africa and the Horn of Africa, but also across to Arabia, to South Asia, Southeast Asia, to China, right across the whole Asian continent and much of Africa. And it's still waiting to spread to other places. It's been in Europe as well. It has varying impacts in different places, but what was for a few years thought to be a local concern only suddenly became really a global concern and a risk to food security. The same is true with blights in bananas, where it appeared in one location and suddenly Black Sigatoka was affecting banana crops around the world because of the genetic uniformity of bananas. So identifying a local problem, and then whether it's health problem, like a human problem, or a livestock, or a local economic crisis even, can suddenly turn into a global crisis. We have to remember that we look back at the 1870s, or we look at 2007, 2008, the crises that we experienced initially were economic crises. Banks collapsed in Austria. And suddenly the bank collapse in Austria in the 1870s spread to banks collapsing in Germany, spread to banks collapsing then in the United States, had a major impact on the new technology, the leading technology of the time that was rolling out around the world, the railway industry, steamships. Suddenly, there are major failures of most of the major railway companies in North America, for example, but also in Latin America, also in Europe. And with those railway company failures, we had a food crisis. The food crisis in terms of access to food and so on got compounded by drought. And things got worse after that. And from the 1870s, roughly 1873 to 1896 in the world, we had a global crisis, which stemmed from a bank collapsing in Austria and affecting a technology which was important to food production and food distribution around the world. So it's that, I think, need to recognize how a local event can suddenly catalyze into a global event. We also, I think, need to recognize that and if I can stick with the economic crisis again, we've had the combination of war and economic crisis today, of course, with what is happening in Ukraine, but also quite recently in the 1940s in both East Africa and in the Bengal region that was then India, we had a war-created crisis where the British government, British colonial power, in trying to manage food production and food distribution to troops and to other parts of the world, made a mess of it. They scrambled up the whole system of food production and distribution in East Africa, causing starvation and disease throughout East Africa and killing thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. At the same time, in Bengal, in then India, we had a huge disaster where something like 4 million people died of starvation and disease, coming from inadequate management of the rice crop in Bengal and shipping of the crop, some parts of the crop, to Sri Lanka, trying to protect against an invasion from Japan, and the British government not being concerned about the well-being of local people and local food producers. So again, a crisis that came out of war in both those occasions. We've had a crisis that seemed really quite minor in the tulip crop, of all things, in the Netherlands in the 1600s, 1640s. It was the very new and young stock market of Amsterdam and Rotterdam. We were excited by the potential of this in a very booming economy of the Netherlands at that time, of speculation in tulips. And that speculation of a plant that came from Turkey, suddenly the market blew up and it collapsed. And with it, thousands and thousands of farmers in the small country went bankrupt. Investors, middle class, not just rich people, but middle class people speculated in the marketplace, went bankrupt. It led to actually genuine hunger. The hunger led to diseases, typhus and dysentery, but also bubonic plague struck at that time, and people were weakened, and so they were more affected by bubonic plague. And more people died because of that. All of that was exacerbated still by the 30 Years' War that was just ending, and which had also stressed supply chains for every part of the economy, and added to a collapse which began in the Netherlands, impacted mainly farmers and middle-class people in the Netherlands, but spread again to impact banking systems and food security throughout Europe and even into the Middle East and North Africa. So these things that, again, start off initially in one location can very quickly spread to others. And we're finding that even today, again. So this crisis can begin with an economic collapse, as we saw in 2007, 2008, and are experiencing now as well. But it can begin with a health crisis, as with the Spanish, or so-called, or the war flu, it's more accurately called the war fever, I think, of 1919, when troops brought a disease around the world again and created a disaster where something, perhaps as many as 100 million people died because of the war fever or Spanish flu. So again, this can originate from many different places, and it's a matter of how do we find ways to collaborate with each other to survive these crises when they do arrive. We should also talk about climate crisis, of course, because if you look through history, while we are entirely, I hate the word to say unprecedented, it's the most common word in the English language, I think now, the unprecedented time we are in with climate change, climate crisis, and with biodiversity collapse in this moment is amazing. But we have in history, several times in history, had a combination of global climatic events which have played out differently in different parts of the world. So something that we see as being, for example, a problem of suddenly the Arctic, as it is happening now, is in a hot, dry moment where the ice is disappearing more rapidly than normal, and that can lead to more water in the air, but also somehow more drought in Western North America. So it plays out again in different ways in different places, and you wouldn't have expected that. Or an El Nino event, which has happened many times in history. We've had times when in the course of a 10 or 12 year time frame, there's been as many as 7 or 8 El Nino events in a row, which is unprecedented. Normally doesn't happen, but does happen sometimes. And when it does happen, suddenly we find ourselves with, again, entirely different things happening in different parts of the world. Drought in Africa, floods and monsoons, extreme monsoons in Asia. Cold conditions in Northern Europe, much too hot in Southern Europe, you can't be quite sure how it will play out in different places. It does play out though. And we're getting better at probably mapping some of those changes, but we still have a long way to go to really understand the impact. If we were looking for a new crisis, the kinds of crises that are most obvious on the horizon now, they probably come from technologies. And our inability still to understand that. In the last webinar, our colleagues from Argentina talked about the threat of new technologies and how that could lead to collapse, not just cybercrime, but internet collapse. In the last few weeks, probably nothing has been talked about more than in science than artificial intelligence and the new machine learning systems. And the potential for a collapse there is enormous. Cetra Group for quite some time now, for about 15 years, has been dealing with the issue of geoengineering and the threat of geoengineering as some sort of quick fix solution being proposed by some industries to respond to crisis in global warming. As the temperature rises, is there a quick solution to either sucking carbon dioxide out of the environment, or is there a quick solution to lower temperatures by blowing sulfates into the stratosphere? Well, these are incredibly complicated questions, and position that Cetra Group and many other organizations have taken is that this is a disaster for the world to rely upon untested technologies. And it's especially dangerous to rely upon a technology which may be controlled by a handful of scientists or led by one or two countries, or maybe even just one country. But can you imagine with artificial intelligence, and given the complexities of trying to manage the climate, trying to adjust all parts of the globe to deal with global warming and to lower temperatures in some artificial way. So that's given over to artificial intelligence, and we allow a machine, a ChatGPT, to decide for us how we're going to handle it. And of course, who is behind that, setting out the algorithms for ChatGPT to protect whose parts of the planet for what kinds of interests? I think it poses an entirely new threat. We've joked in the past about the 4 horsemen apocalypse as a joke. We think of the 4 horsemen as being clearly that there is hunger or famine is one of them, war is another one, and disease is the third. The identity of the 4th horseman of the apocalypse has never been clear. And people always debate, well, who is it really? What does it mean? I'd suggest that it might well be artificial intelligence. We might find that that's going to be the threat that will control our futures more than anything else. And we have to be prepared for that. Expect that kind of a change will also impact us. And that takes a lot of thinking about it and how do we respond. But then I think perhaps it's most helpful to think then, well, how do we respond in specific situations? What are the steps that can be taken? And again, this will change dramatically depending on where you are in the world and whether you're thinking about the global or the national or the local levels. Cultures change everything, and we can't be sure what it will be, but there are some broad areas I think we might talk about. There's always, of course, preparation. What do you do in advance of a crisis? What can you do? Secondly, what do you do during the crisis? And thirdly, what are the lessons learned from a crisis? And how can we position ourselves in a crisis to try to turn it into a positive in some way, or get some good out of that crisis in some way or another? Because again, it's entirely possible that what is one person's threat is another person's advantage. And it may be that there are ways we can take advantage of these things. So let's assume that a crisis begins in the health sector first. We discover that there's a new disease. And that disease, it could be similar to another sort of a COVID experience, or it could be quite different. And it might impact in different ways, different levels of contagion, and so on. But in preparation for that, if we assume that the health sector is the group, those involved in the health movement say to their communities around them, the other sectors, we have a problem here, we can identify, we need to act together, then how do we act together? Can we find, we do an inventory in advance of what health services we have, where are the weaknesses in the health service, how will those health services impact different generations, different genders, different cultures, different economic categories of people, different classes, how will they respond to that? Will it be different for different groups living in different locations, even within perhaps a community? So test that out, understand what the impact might possibly be. What do we have in terms of drugs and medical devices and so on that might be needed for a major disease? What's the capacity to actually get more of those things in short notice? What's the supply chain like? What are the alternatives to that? Where can we look to for traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge that will help us use local resources to respond to a crisis? I remember a few years ago when we were looking at problems of nanotechnology and about how nanotechnology could be helpful in the health sector, and looking at nano filters that could purify water, get arsenic out of the water system, for example, to provide safe drinking to people in a drought environment. Well, one strategy was to use nanotechnology and its huge, vast implications. The other one was, as scientists recognized, was to take a sari, if you were in Bangladesh or India, fold it over 5 times and pour the water through the sari. And that was better at purifying or getting arsenic out of the water than anything else that had been developed by nanotechnology. So there's often local ways of solving a problem that or maybe not as good sometimes better, that can be used, and we need to look at those options in advance. How do we replace the surgical masks, replace the gloves, or whatever is required to protect us in a hospital environment or walking about in the community? Where do we find those things? How do we protect health workers? How do we make sure that those on the front line of a health system have food? That's not going to be the major problem, is feeding themselves and their families in the middle of a crisis where they're working all of the time trying to help the rest of us. How do we support unions of health workers? How do we look at map out the disease pattern and sort out from that the kinds of steps we can take to delay the spread of the disease, using practical methods around us? There's, I think, dozens of steps there that can be taken. How do we look for now the collateral damages that come out of a disease, knowing that faced with an epidemic, we may find that other forms of protection, whether it's against malaria or inoculations against childhood diseases, that will fall away and the health system will not be able to address that. Can we be aware of that in advance and think of ways to ameliorate that problem in one way or another, or knowing that it's going to happen, be prepared for it afterward? And again, how can the health system go to the food system and say, can you help us? What can you do to make sure that we have the safest, most nutritious food possible in the quantity we need it in the middle of this crisis? So it's that level of collaboration. And from the food system side too, it's some really interesting challenges there. There are again, the questions around producing more food, community gardens, backyard gardens, taking over any available plot of land to grow food. There's the concerns about community kitchens and food distribution, food transportation. Some of those I think are not so hard for those of us with a long experience in the food system to sort of understand what the steps might be. But again, if we think in advance of what can be done, in advance of the crisis, can we now identify where more food could be grown? And what are the barriers to getting that land used for the food that we actually need? Can that be sorted out at this time? Can we do an inventory of food resources and water resources, transportation resources that can be mobilized to make sure that food gets to the right place? Can that be done now? Can we now put together the kind of arguments that will be strongest for civic officials or national officials to say, here's where agroecology can step in, or here's what we don't need to have, and here's what we do need to have to support agroecological production systems? Can that be done at this stage in advance of the crisis instead of later on? And then can we, during the crisis, see what is happening and be able to report quickly back as to the successes and failures of systems when that crisis comes to an end or draws to some kind of conclusion. Most importantly, I think, we tend to not look at, and governments don't look at either, are the kind of legal steps, legislative steps, regulatory steps that can be taken that can in some way protect all of us in a crisis. Can we take advantage of some of those tools to step in and, let's say in the case of the food system, perhaps a community is surrounded by land which is contracted for export agriculture of crops that annual crops that are not helpful to the community. Can a local government or a national government or provincial government step in and say, well, we're going to utilize regulations around roads, around transportation, around weights of trucks on highways, around rules of transportation, repair systems for highways, to throw up barriers to make it impossible for major plantations or major export companies to move food out of the region. They're artificial in some ways, but they're creations of tools that can be used at the municipal level or at the provincial level or at the national level that can prevent exports without perhaps getting an immediate blowback or attack coming from the WTO or coming from national companies or international companies. Can there be health regulations in terms of food safety regulations? Can there be rules put into place around taxation of some of the supply chain elements that are important to the food system that make it hard again for food exports out of the country when it's not helpful to the local community? Can that be done? These are sort of semi-legal in a sense. They might be challenged in the courts ultimately, but in the time of crisis, they could work very well. Can we use force majeure to stop contracts? Can we use the rules of the TRIPS negotiations under intellectual property rights to say that farm machinery repairs must be done locally or can be done locally, that all of the patents around those in contracts around that are suspended in order to ensure that food is being produced? Can we make an inventory of all of those kinds of possible tools in the food system that let us get through an immediate crisis and show us tools that we can use in the future as well? And again, most especially when it's over, can we make a strong case for why some things failed and some things worked well, and why it is then that a different approach to the food system than the industrial food chain would be wise for all of us to follow, and we have a chance to make a better system afterward. I think there's a whole wide range of tools, legal, semi-legal, not legal at all in terms of civil disobedience, but ones that can be taken that in an emergency it can be entirely justified in terms of human rights, absolutely justified to protect us from either a health crisis or a food crisis, or a climate crisis again, wherever it originates from. The whole challenge is to get outside of just looking to take the example of food, to seeing ourselves as simply a food movement, not attached to all of the other movements and concerns there of consumers and producers, whatever part of the system we're in, to find ways to collaborate together in advance, and the inventory work that needs to be done and preparation that needs to be done along the way. I think a great deal can be done there, and I think history does show us that. We began this whole discussion of predictable surprises by saying that we are in a century of surprises and a century of crisis. That's obviously true. We have to assume that at least once a decade, perhaps more often than that, we will find ourselves in a crisis which certainly has profound local or national implications, very, very often will have global implications, and where readiness to respond to that crisis, whether it comes out of war or it comes out of disease or it comes out of drought, that readiness is we're ready for. We're ready to act on it. We know who we can work with. And again, we've talked occasionally about, but not enough probably, about multiple sort of crop failures or multiple system failures for food. And if we look back at history, we'll realize that they're quite common. Finger millet rust or blight in the 1940s in East Africa, in Kenya initially, spread throughout the Horn of Africa, East Africa, into Central Africa, and then spread across to the South Asia again and Southeast Asia. Finger millet is a blast disease in that crop, that important food crop. But the most important thing to remember about finger millet and the blast fungal disease that came with it is that it hopped to 50 different plant species, including wheat, including rice, including barley, and many other crops, many other millet crops. So it didn't stay in one place. Same as we see diseases, livestock hopping from one species to another, and from poultry or from hogs to people. It's equally true that crop diseases can spread from one crop to another, to another, to another, and spread around the world. So bearing that in mind and thinking about what those challenges are, we're preparing for that now, preparing for the kinds of diversity we need to create now to survive these crises in the decades ahead is absolutely important. What can we grow if we can't grow that crop? Where do we get advice that can be trusted from farm organizations and other places that can say to us, here's something you can try, here's something you can do, here's some options for you, and accessing what we need to survive faced with a wide range of perhaps diseases that could impact us. So that was a quick run through of some of the challenges. We could say a lot more about the technological challenges because they are so strongly there, especially as we now contemplate artificial intelligence and the complexities of the food and health chains that we've created in the last few decades that are so dangerous. But we can also, I think, recognize the importance of looking out to seeing where else the crisis might first come from, and how do we collaborate with others to make sure that there's security for all of us. Can I leave it at that then, Veronica, and then we can have more conversation? Oh, sorry, Soledad.
Sí, Pat, sure. Yes, we can. Muchísimas gracias, Pat, por
Thank you
ese
very much,
recorrido
Pat, for that
tan
journey
potente.
so complete.
Justamente esta intervención que hacías vos,
And this intervention that you were carrying out allows us once again to be able to see a sign that may seem that it could be an early warning or a ways to be able to look at things. That every time more and more we can see that these alerts require what Veronica was saying, that we have to observe with attention and listen to each other in an early part of the process. We have to listen to each other because all of these alerts, that some of the movements of the food system saw these, they're never 100% surprised. There's elements that we can have intuition to. And the exercise that we wanted to propose to all of you today is that we can carry out 2 work groups to be able to talk a little bit more in depth. On one hand, it can be to share what these early alerts are, which is what we have been talking about in the previous sessions. And also, we would like to start answering some questions regarding how we can prepare our movements better so that we can face these surprises and be able to visualize them with anticipation. So to think a lot about the capabilities and the resources that we need to have to develop systems of early warnings. If we are, do we have the capability? How can we assess if we are capable? And how can we naturalize this way of working and not always actioning this only when we need it at the moment, but to have these processes of working long term in the preparedness and what things should we start to change to be able to introduce this more strategic view. So there we talk about last night with some of my coworkers. This is an exercise even for the ETC group. ETC has always had this idea that we have to launch the warnings. We have to see things before they come and see them from a distance, understand them and accompany others that they can develop their contention plan so they can act on time. And somehow this predictable surprises attempt is that we can have a more collective tool, that we can also work with others so we can listen to each other more and know that the warnings come from different places and that we need a lot more heads, we need a lot more to be able to see the complexity that is being offered in this difficult future that we are dealing with from the movement for the food systems. And we would also like in this conversation that we could think in a methodological way, concrete things that we could build looking forward. What interests are there? Where do we feel there is something that needs to be discussed more deeply? What organizations have the desire to have this reflection and preparedness process? And with this, I would like to have Tom explain to us how we are going to divide.
Thank you very much, Soledad. I'm Tom Wake from etc. I'm afraid we have a technical problem where somehow the breakout function has dropped off the Zoom. So unless we have a brilliant magic solution, I think we're going to have to start in plenary, which at least means we don't have the problem of interpreting. Because I've tried being made the host and the breakout option isn't appearing, so apologies for that. So I think we will just open up for contributions along the lines that Soledad said.
Bueno, no somos un grupo tan grande tampoco, así que no es problema. Vamos a tener tiempo
We're
para...
not such a big group, so that shouldn't be a problem. We will have time, it'll give us time to allow many of you to speak. Therefore, let's open up the space so we can each share our ideas. So if anybody would like to speak, go ahead.
Jim.
Jim, adelante.
Sure, I'll break the ice. Thank you. There was really lots of food for thought there, Pat and Veronica, and what you were saying. And I just like to say some of the things that it raised for me about some of the questions that we need to face, and maybe this goes along the way that you're hoping we will have our conversations. The first thing that it brought up was thinking about the question of how fit our own organizational forms are for doing this kind of horizon scanning, flexibility in response to surprises, being able to see things coming. And in order to do that, it needs a certain, you need tentacles. We need to have tentacles out into other movements. We need to have tentacles out into things beyond our own specialization. We need to have tentacles into other regions. We need to have a form where we're listen. We need to have tentacles with ears at the end or something like that. And then we also need kind of the space and the capacity to listen, and to be able to listen to things that don't seem immediately relevant to us and what we're doing day to day, and then with others discuss and think how they might be relevant. And I think both of those things, and a third thing is we need to have more of a ability to deal with general issues, to be generalists and not be so specialized. Many of us have been pushed to be specialists on nanotechnology or the FAO or something like that, and the more specialist you are, the less you're generally understanding the bigger picture and able to listen. And that includes things like, as Pat's bringing so strongly, having a general understanding of history and things that have happened in the past and so forth. And guess what that brought up for me is how badly formatted our many of our civil society forms are for that kind of work. That we've been very pushed, particularly by the funding model, towards specialized NGOs that focus in more specialized and expert ways on smaller and smaller things. And you know, I had a conversation a couple of days ago with an NGO who's working on issues around fossil fuels and the food system and so forth. And they're, you know, like many, there's such a focus on trying to build specialization, trying to build up deeper and deeper knowledge on smaller and smaller things that you know, and that's just in the other direction. So how can we change even the funding model? You know, there are $500 billion given every year by philanthropy, and most of it goes towards specialized NGOs with ever more specialized knowledge. How can we shift that around so that there is resources for civil society organizations, networks, movements to connect, to listen, to have tentacles, to think about history, so I think there's a real problem in the model of how civil society is working today, and it's only getting worse. And then the second thing that occurs to me is from that comment, which we've said so many times, that this is going to be a century of surprises. But we haven't got forms, civic forms that exist to be ready for surprises. I was thinking about how the transition towns movement kind of arose, how communities tried to think about the transition that's needed in the face of climate change. Well, that's about transition. But where are the forms that are about being prepared for surprises? In a way, these forms pop up every time there is a surprise. We get the mutual aid groups that spring up and the citizens brigades that spring up, but there's not a lot of support for those between the surprises. And maybe we need to talk about creating like surprise brigades who are there continually, knowing that this is going to be a century of surprises. They're there to be thinking about what surprises are there and to be ready to jump into the breach as each surprise emerges with that kind of flexibility. So that's a suggestion: surprise brigades.
Gracias, Jim. ¿Alguien más que le
Thank you,
gustaría?
Jim. Would anybody else also like to share?
I love the idea of surprise brigades. That's a surprise SWAT teams.
Hay varias personas que, ahí está Mónica, muy bien. Mónica, te
I
presentas.
see various hands. Oh, Monica, please introduce yourself. We haven't listened to you during the previous sessions. I was going to say that many of you have been here for the 3 sessions. So, Monica, welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you. I'm going to be speaking Spanish, and I can turn on my camera because I have some issues with one of my eyes. But I wanted to bring back to the table something that was mentioned during the first session that has to do with some territories where a capital is more aggressive. She was talking about what happened in the US, which was a mirror to what was going on in Mexico. Oh, sorry, I'm from Grain. I didn't introduce myself. So we need to use those regions where capital have been more aggressive as mirrors from which we can learn because of what happened in those territories. Here I see Ramon and Pepe. We have been working together on the issues with avocado in Mexico as a model for work. And we're also trying to identify the areas that are endangered, that are at risk. and trying to work with those regions to prevent the arrival of the crisis that is going to happen, to be able to work together and try to prevent. And I also wanted to say something about free trade, because I think it's something we haven't mentioned, but I think it's also useful. Try to be alert of those trade strategies. I'm thinking about the US, where right now this is changing. What is that going to produce? And maybe that way we can be ready for those changes in trade agreements. We need to be ready for those changes because they are coming. I think we need to be alert and try to work on that in advance. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Gracias, Mónica.
Thank you, Monica.
Si no hay nadie, yo tenía una idea que quería
So
compartir.
if
Si
no one else
simplemente
has
me
anything to
gustaría
say, I have an idea that I would like to share.
escuchando un poco lo que
I
decía Jim
was
sobre la necesidad de
listening to what Jim said about the need for more spaces to listen to one another. I think we can learn previous experiences for things movements are already doing to keep working on this. For example, we have the training schools that are organized by the MCT. They have many days and lots of time to reflect on history. In my experience, beyond what you're learning, beyond the subjects or the contents, you have a space for conversation. You have more time there than anywhere else because you have time to share different views, focused on particular topics, following the contents of these trainings. And that's something that's rare, having the opportunity to talk like we have during those training sessions. And I think that having time to reflect is what is actually useful, because it's hard to have just 1 hour to discuss topics in more depth. We can talk about a few things, but we don't have time to go deeper into the issues. And I think what Tim was saying, right, thinking of how to push for more resources, the resources that fund these NGOs go to financing these spaces for training and for experience exchange, to be able to listen to others more actively. I think that's useful. I think we should build on what we already have, the things that already have a long-term impact, and build on that. I think another interesting tool that we could use is building these communities for reflection around early warnings or predictable surprises. Things that are more simple, things that maybe we can organize at the regional level, perhaps. Maybe you will laugh, but I don't know if you watched that movie about zombies, that movie with Brad Pitt, where he saves everyone. And he says that in Israel, they would have 10 people and always have one thinking about the worst case scenario. That was his work, thinking about the worst case scenario. And I think that makes a lot of sense, having some spaces where we have time to think about these worst case scenarios, where one of us could maybe talk about this potential scenario. And so we can give ourselves time to reflect on that potential scenario. I think these are a couple of things we could do that can help us shape this result we want from this exercise. Yes, I would like to say something as well. While we were third session, we had two options. One was focusing on and sharing ideas, and the other option had to do with deciding if we were going to keep up this work in the future, if we wanted to keep working as a group to reflect on these topics. But we haven't asked you as participants, what are your expectations from this meeting? Even within ETC, we had different opinions on the path forward. One option could be to be there to provoke, that's what we like to say, right? To keep up with this line of work, and we would like to facilitate that. We can. But another option would be for you as a group to talk about your expectations. What do you expect from us as facilitators? I just wanted to be transparent because, of course, we don't have that much time to prepare a plan, a detailed plan. But what I wanted to say is that we thought about proposing a methodology to think about the future and then think about specific actions that we can work on. But we never thought about keep working as a group. We would like to repeat this experience in other spaces. We're working on the methodology to be able to do these workshops in person, and maybe in one community, or maybe in-person sessions, or maybe repeat this experience globally, online. But we are systematizing all your suggestions. So if you have ideas on how to move forward, if you would like to continue with this specific group, of course, we are open to that idea. But the original question was that as part of each of your struggles, what else can we do as part of your daily work? What other ideas do you have? Pat had a long list of options, and in order to be transparent, we decided not to propose any formula, any particular formula. But of course, we have so many options. It is open for discussion, for you to say, what would you like?
También hablamos mucho de la dificultad de transmitir.
We also talked about how difficult it is to explain or share this lens, right? This unique perspective, because we have 170 minutes to do that, and it's hard to get to an agreement in this short period of time, right? This is more abstract, I think. So last night I was discussing this with another colleague, and we were saying, reflecting on the participation we've seen, it's hard to think about a future that we can call ours when our present today is broken. During the previous session, Pat talked about potential famine. One of our colleagues in Guatemala said, we are already experiencing that in various regions here. So we need to take this into consideration as well, right? Would anyone else like to say something?
I think I saw Pat's hand. Is that right, Pat?
Yes, if that's okay, I just wanted to come back a little bit to an idea that Jim had mentioned. I think it resonated with everybody, which is the starting point of being our own organizations and what do we need. But it's also, I think, yes, there's what do we need internally and there's what do we need externally in a way. There've been a couple of examples, I think, in the last little while where we've had wider cross-sectoral collaborations in civil society than we normally have. One that stands out for me is around multi-stakeholderism and the recognition that there's a strategy by the World Economic Forum and others to really change the whole nature of governance, global governance, into this sort of a group of friends getting together in industry and government with a few token NGOs around to plot the future and do as we want to. And civil society has, I think, caught on to that very well, and across not just food and health and human rights, but all the sectors recognize that this is a threat to all of us, and there's got to be a way we have to work together on that. And I think that's been important, that what do we need to have that kind of ability to identify that as a threat, and what do we need to work together so each of our organizations can work most effectively in responding to that kind of threat. I think another example is around technologies, where the recognition of the importance of big data, and now I think more clearly issues around artificial intelligence, more specifically, I guess, are so cross-cutting in every sector of the economy and every aspect of human life, that they demand everybody to talk to each other more and find ways to work together. So besides our own local organizational needs or institutional needs, what's necessary to be looking ahead and early warning and early listening around these issues beyond ourselves.
Well, Nick, thanks.
Hi, I'm Nick from IPES Food, and we've been working on the Long Food Movement project with Etc. Group, and I'm really interested to hear all the fantastic comments so far. Yeah, to pick up on a couple of things that have come up so far. I mean, my sense is that it's just so incredibly difficult to plan for things we can't plan for, right? Nobody's suggesting that we can. So the question then is just how can we build those sort of underlying infrastructures so that we're as ready as we can possibly be and to be able to react to them. And just one thing that I keep coming back to in my head is having more convenings, more, we're talking about listening and being able to pick up on things other groups are working on, kind of emerging issues. And I'm thinking, when are the times that you actually do that in your daily work? And for me, it's often when you go to a big conference or a convening and you have a chance to have those conversations and hear about things a bit more outside your normal sort of interactions and issues you're dealing with. So if there were more kind of global convening spaces for food movements and food movements plus others, maybe this kind of listening function would happen more readily. And yeah, I don't have the long view in terms of what fora were there before, which ones are there now. I know that the FAO and the World Committee on Food Security is a place where we as an organization tend to go to organize events and be involved in the legislative work partly, but also just to be able to have that moment of connecting and listening to ideas. And in recent years, that's been more difficult with the pandemic and with the regular challenges to these spaces, right? With the Food Systems Summit and other sort of competing spaces, and how difficult it is to attend and be part of these spaces, particularly for groups with less means. So I feel like that's a crucial aspect of all of this, is just to be able to be able to identify convening places where we can all be as a movement and have those conversations, which in some level are that sharing moment, that way to be sort of slightly more aware than we would be otherwise of things that are going on. One other thing that, you know, could be useful to build these infrastructures is just, funding. I mean, it's come up again, different modes of funding, funding that's more open-ended, that can be activated quickly in a crisis moment to just be able to get responses together more quickly. And, you know, a very recent example I've sort of experienced firsthand is how the European Farm to Fork strategy has been attacked and is now on the verge of collapse, because essentially industry lobbies have been quicker and more effective than NGOs in getting their narratives across in the wake of the Ukraine war and food security threats. I'm trying to think what could have prevented that happening, and possibly having more funding available to quickly mobilize and to get it to the people who could be putting out very hard-hitting reports or just gatherings to you know, bring together different responses. I feel like that, you know, that could be a useful mechanism as well, having more more open-ended funding. Just a couple of ideas to share.
Yeah.
Tom.
Thanks. Yeah, coming directly off Nick's comment, but also I think going back, Monica also touched on, I think, what conversations need to happen at the grassroots. And I think, Nick, when you said, so we can, I guess you're probably including, but I want to make explicit the groups of peasants, smallholder farmers, indigenous peoples who have sort of generations of expertise of disruption, of technological imposition, and also have some many forms of wisdom about what can survive dramatic changes, whether it be through colonialism or floods or all sorts of changes. And I think I would just supplement the sort of rapid response element with a sort of inclusive response, including people who don't necessarily speak European languages. Now that is I realize that's a huge ask in terms of funding, but I'm just thinking, we know lots of examples from the food area, but I'm also struck by work about some very isolated incidents, or more isolated than pandemics, which were things like the Ebola outbreak, where actually there's been quite a few studies, including one I think by Paul Richards, about the Ebola outbreak, showing that actually indigenous peoples and local knowledge was absolutely vital, but didn't tend to get documented. And so I think we, yeah, it's sort of, it touches on health themes, not just food themes as well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Someone else? Well, we still have, these are our, yeah, just a comment. These are our last 10 to 15 minutes in closure of the whole process. So feel free to comment in whatever direction you feel it's useful to just wrap up the idea of what we think about and how we reflect on what has been discussed here. No pressure. So, Diego.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Perdón que no.
Hello. I will not be turning my camera on. I apologize, but the place that I am does not make it comfortable to turn the camera on. One thing, my name is Rodrigo. I am working for a network where we have like to highlight some things that that I agree with. One of them is being able to work having to do with immediate impact. I think in any kind of exercise, we have to have this pressure and this mold that I think is ruining our work, and the militancy of an impact and results from having to have it from one day to the next. So this exercise of being able to take that of immediate out of the question helps a lot. And this obligation of being able to work on programmatic thinking, thinking of long term, and to be able to align certain priorities, whether they be political or not, that can work the points or those more long-term issues. And in working in the area of the agriculture, I think in going back to see what role on one hand, we're trying to see how we can identify and have this method having to do with crisis and be multidimensional and be in many different locations and with different people. I think multi-theme and multi-sector would also be good. It's a proposal of VTC as how it has been working strongly in the agricultural area, but I think also we should be able to get to other sectors, and that this kind of exercise can start giving account of what other views are being seen and how they can be related. And another point, and also a second point with that, is how we can work on reaction scenarios and how to work as scenarios that are programmed on points that these movements have. And the third point, how to do it with time, how to do it in a way, it can be virtual because we don't have any other option at this time, but these encounters, they be every other month, just a couple, they can also be giving us time to be able to reflect. I hope that that is my little grain of salt, and I hope that that's useful. Thank you, Diego.
¿Alguien más? ¿Unos comentarios de cierre?
Would
think I
anybody
saw
else like
Pat's
to give
hand
any
one more time.
closing comments?
If someone else wants to speak, I'll wait.
No, go ahead.
Well, I just I'm going to regret saying this, I think, but when Nick mentioned the fora for wider groups coming together, one of those immediate possibilities, I suppose, is for all its limitations, is the midterm evaluation of the SDGs, which brings a wide cross-section of civil society together. Whatever the UN does is one thing, but a large range of folks in civil society come together at least, and there might be some possibilities there. And then I can just say sadly, regretfully, that we don't still have the possibilities of the World Social Forum, and perhaps didn't use it as well as we could have at the time, even to as a place where civil society could have a much wider ranging discussion than we normally have. But I think it's very important to again find those spaces where a wider range of civil society is in conversation. I also think, by the way, just to add that there are foundations that also have a very broad perspective in their work, and you would also be they would be prepared to support that kind of activity, that they would see that the cross-fertilization that can take place in their various sectors that they support in their funding would benefit by people being able to come together and have a good discussion.
Mónica.
A ver, sí, bueno,
Monica, yes. In these few minutes that are left, I would not like to leave you with the impression that there's not much reaction to this huge effort that has been carried out to work on this, and with the wealth and the contribution of all 3 sessions. But my first tendency would be on the how to continue. I think it would be very interesting to be able to have like a pilot experience, to like have something to create like a spheres or an outline or a preparation of the crisis and then what is next. But for example, to be able to get that first step in the preparation to monitor something specific. I know that that goes a little bit against what Jim was saying, which also convinced me a lot of trying to avoid to become specialists in one area. But that's why I was wondering if I should say this or not. But we start with something small that we can try as a tools, methodologies, and maybe we could have it useful for others. Because if not, it overwhelms you with all the crisis we have. And it may act. It's just a proposal. Thank you, Monica.
Bueno, de todas maneras, no es un problema que no.
It's not a problem either way that there not be any reactions. When we started this process, it was always very open to even see who had interest in talking about this. It's not that there is a result. We thought it was very important to see who was willing to listen and talk about this. That's why in the previous session, I said any mechanism, but if you think about something and you want to send us an email later with some ideas, very valid, because we are starting to talk about and unite these different that are with people who are willing to work in always with this attention, how much can we do from the NGOs and how can we work on the tools that we have.
Varios materiales muy concretos como para regresar sobre lo que hemos llovido de ideas. Y habrá un sitio web que albergue todos estos materiales. El sitio web del, en inglés le llamamos el Long Food Project. Será el proyecto continuo por la alimentación. Tendrá su sitio con todo este material y hay incluso una descripción pues muy cariñosa de todo este esfuerzo hecho desde el grupo ETC y IPES, IPES Food. Está la descripción para que si es posible que la retomen y la puedan replicar en sus lugares de trabajo, pues con mucho cariño va a quedar esta protometodología de cómo pensar las crisis y cómo pensar el futuro y cómo combinar la urgencia en la que estamos atrapados con la necesidad de ver más allá, más actores y todo lo que aquí se ha dicho. Hay unos comentarios muy buenos de Jim en el chat y no sé, ya yo lo cerraría acá y no sé si alguien quiere decir la palabra final de esta sesión. Estaremos en contacto con cada uno de quienes se suscribieron y quienes asistieron para circular las transcripciones, para circular. Hay una investigación que está terminando Pat y que va a ser el eje de una publicación alrededor de las sorpresas predecibles.
Around the predictable surprises and with all the analysis of the possible next pandemics of Silvia and also the other issues that we have discussed here. Very good then. I'm sorry, Sole, one more thing I don't want to forget. That is, Jim Thomas was in the origin of these ideas, and I wanted to also give him, acknowledge him and give him recognition, because this creative thinking and the seed that he placed, we hope that it can continue turning into a large plant and a tree. Thank you, Jim. And always the support of Pat for the ETC group and IPES Food. Okay, then I would like to thank you all so much, and thank you, Pat, as well, for also collaborating with such a warm heart in all of this process. And we will be writing and contacting soon. It's always a pleasure to be able to find each other here in these spaces. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Hasta luego, compañeras. Bye.
Hasta
Thank
luego.
you.
Thank you
Bye.
very much. See you
Thanks.
later. Bye.